In the quiet town of Columbia, South Carolina, Jada's life unfolded with a gentle rhythm. At 52, she had long accepted that motherhood was a dream left behind, a possibility sealed shut by medical verdicts delivered in her youth. Diagnosed with infertility decades earlier, she had carved out a life of quiet purpose, immersing herself in her work at the local library and tending to her garden. Her home, a modest two-story house, nestled on a street lined with oak trees, was a sanctuary draped in vibrant blooms, roses, hydrangeas, and marigolds that she nurtured with care. The garden had become her refuge, a place where she could escape the lingering ache of losing her first husband 15 years prior. His absence still cast a soft shadow over her days, but she had learned to carry it with grace, filling her time with books, community events, and the small joys of a life she had carefully rebuilt. Jada's mornings began with routine. She rose early, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat on her porch, watching the neighborhood stir to life. The air carried the scent of dew and freshly cut grass, and she often lingered there, savoring the calm before heading to the library. Her role there was more than a job, it was a calling. She organized reading programs for children, recommended novels to regulars, and kept the shelves in meticulous order. The library, with its creaking wooden floors and soft hum of fluorescent lights, felt like an extension of her home. Colleagues respected her quiet efficiency, and patrons appreciated her warm, unassuming presence. Outside of work, her garden demanded her attention. She spent hours pruning, planting, and weeding, her hands moving with practiced ease through the soil. The flowers were her pride, a testament to her ability to create beauty in a world that had once seemed barren. But one crisp autumn morning, the rhythm of Jada's life faltered. She woke feeling off. Her stomach churned with nausea, her limbs felt heavy, and a faint dizziness clouded her thoughts. She dismissed it as exhaustion, perhaps a lingering effect of a late night spent cataloguing new library acquisitions. Yet the unease persisted through the day, nagging at her as she shelved books and smiled at patrons. By evening, the symptoms had not faded. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the untouched plate of food before her, and decided to act. She called the local clinic, a small facility she had visited for routine checkups, and scheduled an appointment for the following day. The decision felt practical, a simple step to rule out anything serious. She went to bed that night expecting little more than a prescription for rest or perhaps a minor ailment. The next day, Jada arrived at the clinic, a squat brick building on the edge of town. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and old magazines, and she sat quietly, flipping through a worn copy of a gardening journal. When her name was called, she followed a nurse to an examination room, her steps steady but her mind unsettled. The doctor, a middle-aged man with a kind but serious demeanour, reviewed her chart with a furrowed brow. He ordered blood tests and an ultrasound, his tone professional but tinged with curiosity. Jada lay on the examination table, staring at the ceiling as the ultrasound technician moved the wand across her abdomen. The room was silent save for the soft hum of the machine. She expected nothing unusual, perhaps a confirmation of a stomach bug or fatigue. But when the doctor returned, his expression had shifted. He sat across from her, his hands folded, and delivered news that struck like a sudden storm. Jada was pregnant. The words hung in the air, impossible and absurd. She stared at the doctor, her mind racing to process what she had heard. Her body, deemed incapable of conceiving for over 2 decades, had defied every medical expectation. The doctor explained that the tests were conclusive, showing elevated hormone levels consistent with early pregnancy. He spoke of rare cases of medical anomalies, but his words blurred in Jada's ears. She had spent years mourning the children she would never have, building a life around that certainty. Now that certainty crumbled. She clutched the edge of the examination table, her knuckles whitening as she tried to anchor herself. The doctor handed her a printout of the test results, a clinical document filled with numbers and medical jargon, but to Jada, it was a map to an unknown world. Leaving the clinic, Jada walked to her car in a daze. The streets of Columbia, usually familiar and comforting, felt alien. She drove home slowly, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. The test results lay on the passenger seat, a tangible reminder of the impossible truth. At home, she sat in her living room, the paper still in her hand, staring out the window at her garden. The flowers, usually a source of solace, seemed distant, their colours muted by the weight of her thoughts. She traced back through her life, searching for an explanation, but found none. The doctors had been clear all those years ago. Her body could not sustain a pregnancy. Yet here she was, carrying a life within her, a mystery that defied logic. Jada's mind churned with questions. How could this have happened? What did it mean for her future, for the life she had so carefully constructed? She thought of her first husband, whose memory still lingered in the quiet moments of her day. She thought of Darryl, her current husband, and how he would react to this news. The weight of it all pressed against her, but she could not yet bring herself to share it. For now, she sat alone, the test results crumpled in her hand, her world irrevocably altered by a truth she could neither explain nor escape. Jada returned to her home in Columbia, South Carolina, the weight of the impossible news still heavy in her hands. The crumpled test results lay on the kitchen counter, a silent testament to the upheaval in her life. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across her garden, she gathered the courage to share the truth with Darryl, her husband of 7 years. She found him in the living room, his broad frame settled into the worn leather recliner, a football game flickering on the television. Jada stood in the doorway, her heart pounding, and revealed the doctor's findings. Darryl's reaction was immediate and visceral. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened, a storm of disbelief clouded his usually composed demeanor. He sat motionless, as if the words had struck him like a physical blow, his mind grappling with a reality that seemed absurd. Darryl was a man of logic, a mechanic who approached life with the precision of someone accustomed to fixing what was broken. The idea of Jada's pregnancy, given her medical history, defied everything he understood. His thoughts spiraled into darker territory, conjuring images of betrayal that he could not shake. He began to question her, his voice low but sharp, probing for answers she could not provide. Jada, stunned by the accusation in his eyes, tried to reassure him. She explained her own confusion, her insistence that there had been no one else, but her words seemed to dissolve in the air between them. Darryl's skepticism grew, feeding on itself, and he retreated into silence, his gaze fixed on the television, though his mind was elsewhere. Jada felt the distance between them widen, a chasm she had not anticipated. The news, like wildfire, spread beyond the walls of their home. Columbia was a small town, its streets woven with gossip that travelled faster than truth. By the next morning, whispers had reached Darryl's family. His sister, a sharp-tongued woman who ran a local bakery, called him, her voice thick with suspicion. She questioned Jada's character, planting seeds of doubt that took root in Darryl's already troubled mind. His parents, devout and traditional, visited the house, their expressions a mix of concern and judgment. They sat stiffly on the couch, their eyes darting to Jada as if searching for signs of guilt. The neighborhood, too, buzzed with speculation. Neighbors who once waved warmly as Jada tended her garden now averted their gazes or lingered too long at their fences, murmuring to one another. At the library, her sanctuary of books and routine, colleagues grew distant. They avoided small talk, their smiles forced, their glances fleeting. Jada felt the weight of their scrutiny, as if she were a stranger in a place she had called home for years. Darryl's distrust deepened with each passing day. Unable to reconcile the news with reason, he began to scrutinize Jada's every move. He checked her phone when she left the room, scrolling through her messages with a furrowed brow, searching for evidence that did not exist. He noted the times she left for work and returned, questioning any deviation from her usual schedule. One evening, he followed her to the grocery store, staying a block behind in his truck, his heart pounding with a mix of shame and suspicion. Jada, unaware of his actions, felt the strain in their interactions. The warmth that had once defined their marriage was replaced by a cold formality, each conversation laced with unspoken accusations. She moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps soft, as if afraid to disturb the fragile tension that had settled over them. In a desperate bid for answers, Darryl contacted a private investigator, a grizzled man recommended by a co-worker. The investigator, accustomed to cases of infidelity, took the job with a nod, promising discretion. He tailed Jada for days, following her from the library to the clinic, from the grocery store to her garden. He rifled through public records, interviewed neighbors under the guise of casual conversation, and even lingered outside the library, watching her through the windows. But his reports offered no clarity. There were no secret meetings, no hidden contacts, no evidence to support Daryl's fears. The lack of findings only fueled his frustration, as if the absence of proof was itself a kind of deception. He confronted Jada with the investigator's reports, his voice heavy with accusation, but she could only shake her head, her own confusion mirroring his. Jada, exhausted by the weight of suspicion, began to question herself. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of their bedroom, the soft snores of Daryl beside her, a reminder of the rift between them. Had she missed something? Was there a moment, a detail that could explain the impossible? She retraced her days, her visits to the clinic, her routine, but found no answers. The town's whispers followed her everywhere, through the aisles of the grocery store, the stacks of the library, the rows of her garden. She felt exposed, as if every eye in Colombia was watching, waiting for her to unravel. The isolation was suffocating, and for the first time in years, Jada wondered if the life she had built was slipping away. The pregnancy, once a bewildering miracle, now felt like a burden, a puzzle she could not solve, and a wedge driving her further from the people she loved. The weight of suspicion had settled over Jada's life like a fog, and she could no longer bear the uncertainty that clouded her days. Determined to find clarity, she returned to the clinic in Columbia, South Carolina, where the impossible news of her pregnancy had first been revealed. The familiar brick building, with its sterile waiting room and faint hum of medical equipment, felt less like a place of answers and more like a maze of questions. She sat across from her doctor, a man whose kind eyes now carried a trace of unease and demanded explanations. He reviewed her file, his fingers tracing the lines of her medical history, but could offer little beyond what she already knew. Her pregnancy, given her age and long-standing diagnosis of infertility, was a medical anomaly, a near miracle that defied explanation. Other specialists were consulted, their faces a mix of fascination and skepticism as they pored over her test results. They spoke of rare hormonal shifts, of statistical improbabilities, but their words offered no concrete answers, only deepening the mystery that enveloped her. Among the team was a young geneticist, fresh from medical school, whose curiosity seemed to outstrip his colleagues' caution. He suggested a fetal DNA test, a procedure that could analyze the genetic material of the unborn child to provide definitive answers about its origins. Jada, clinging to the hope that this might quell Daryl's suspicions and silence the town's whispers, agreed without hesitation. The procedure was scheduled, and she endured the wait with a mix of dread and anticipation. For 2 weeks, she moved through her routines, shelving books at the library, watering her garden, avoiding the probing gazes of neighbors, with the weight of the unknown pressing against her. The nights were the hardest, when she lay awake beside Daryl, the silence between them louder than any argument. She wondered what the test would reveal, whether it would bring relief or further unravel the fragile threads of her life. When the results arrived, Jada returned to the clinic alone. The geneticist met her in a small office, his expression unreadable as he handed her a sealed envelope. She opened it, her hands trembling, and scanned the document. The words blurred before her eyes, but one truth stood out with devastating clarity. The father of the child she carried was not Daryl, but her first husband, who had died 15 years earlier. The revelation struck her like a physical blow, her breath catching as her mind struggled to process the impossible. The geneticist explained the findings, his voice steady but tinged with awe. The DNA profile of the fetus matched the genetic markers of her late husband, a man whose memory Jada had carried through years of grief. She sat frozen, the paper slipping from her fingers, as the room seemed to close in around her. How could a man gone for over a decade be the father of her unborn child? The question echoed in her mind, unanswered and unrelenting. The news spread through Colombia with the speed of a wildfire. Daryl, when informed, reacted with a fury born of disbelief. He stormed into the house that evening, clutching a copy of the results, his face a mask of anger and confusion. He accused the laboratory of incompetence, insisting that such an outcome was impossible, a mistake that could only be explained by human error. He called the clinic, demanding a retest, his voice rising with each call, but the staff stood by their findings. The geneticist, calm but firm, reiterated that the results were conclusive, backed by rigorous protocols. Daryl's frustration turned inward, his suspicions of Jada now tangled with a new, bewildering reality. He retreated to the garage, where he spent hours tinkering with an old engine, as if fixing something mechanical could restore order to his world. The ripple effects reached beyond their home. Daryl's family, already skeptical, withdrew further, their visits to the house ceasing entirely. His sister spread the news to her circle, and soon the town was abuzz with speculation. Neighbors whispered of miracles, of supernatural forces, their stories growing wilder with each retelling. At the library, Jada felt the weight of every glance, every hushed conversation that stopped when she entered a room. Even the doctors, though professional, could not hide their astonishment. They consulted colleagues across the state, sharing anonymized details of Jada's case. But no one could offer a plausible explanation. The medical community, like the town, was gripped by a mix of curiosity and disbelief, and Jada became an unwitting enigma at the center of it all. In the quiet of her garden, Jada sought solace among her flowers, the one place where she could escape the scrutiny. She sat on a wooden bench, surrounded by the vibrant hues of her roses and marigolds, and tried to make sense of the impossible. Her first husband had been the love of her youth, a man whose laughter and warmth had filled her life until his sudden death left her hollow. She had grieved him deeply, carrying his memory like a quiet flame through the years. Now, that memory was inexplicably tied to the life growing inside her. She sifted through her past, searching for any clue. A forgotten procedure, a medical trial, anything that might explain this. But her mind came up empty, each memory leading to a dead end. The more she thought, the more the mystery deepened, leaving her with a sense of being untethered, adrift in a story that felt like it belonged to someone else. The town's rumors took on a life of their own. Some spoke of divine intervention, others of strange science, and a few whispered of something darker, unexplainable. Jada, once a familiar figure in Colombia's tight-knit community, felt like an outsider in her own life. She avoided the grocery store, the church, the library's break room, anywhere she might encounter the curious or judgmental. Her garden became her refuge, but even there, she could not escape the questions that haunted her. The child she carried was a link to a past she thought she had buried, a connection to a man she had loved and lost. Yet the how and why remained elusive, a puzzle that seemed to defy not just science, but the 26A5, the very fabric of her reality. As she sat among her flowers, Jada felt the weight of a life that was no longer hers alone, a life now intertwined with an impossible truth that refused to be explained. The impossible truth that Jada's unborn child was linked to her late first husband left her reeling, unable to rest until she uncovered the how and why of this enigma. She could no longer endure the weight of the unknown, the whispers of Columbia, South Carolina, or the silent accusations in Daryl's eyes. Determined to find answers, Jada turned inward, delving into her past with a resolve born of desperation. She began in her attic, a dusty space filled with cardboard boxes and forgotten relics of her life. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and mothballs as she knelt among the stacks, pulling out folders of medical records, receipts, and personal documents. Each piece of paper felt like a fragment of a puzzle, and she sifted through them with meticulous care, her fingers tracing the faded ink of hospital bills and clinic notes from years long past. Her thoughts drifted to the time after her first husband's death, a period shrouded in grief so profound it had blurred her memories. She recalled the overwhelming emptiness that had followed his passing, the way the world had seemed to lose its color. In those days consumed by loss, she had sought ways to hold on to him, to preserve some piece of the life they had planned together. She remembered visiting a fertility clinic in Charleston, a sleek, modern facility where doctors had spoken of hope through science. They had offered in vitro fertilization, a chance to create embryos that could one day become the children she and her husband had dreamed of. In her desperation to keep him close, Jada had agreed to the procedure, allowing the clinic to freeze the embryos they created. But his death had come too soon, shattering those dreams, and she had abandoned the idea of motherhood, burying the decision in the recesses of her mind as she rebuilt her life. The attic search yielded a small, yellowed folder from that Charleston clinic, tucked inside a box of old photographs. Jada's hands trembled as she opened it, finding consent forms and medical summaries dated over 15 years ago. The documents confirmed what her memory struggled to recall. She had authorized the cryopreservation of several embryos, each a potential link to her late husband. The realization hit her with quiet force. She had forgotten this act, this choice made in the fog of grief. The folder offered no answers about how one of those embryos could now be growing inside her, but it was a thread, a starting point. She set the papers aside, her mind racing as she considered what might have happened in the years since. What chain of events could have led to this moment? Jada turned her attention to more recent records, pulling out a binder of medical documents from the past year. She had visited the Columbia Clinic for what she believed was a routine procedure to address an ovarian cyst. The memory of that visit was hazy, clouded by the discomfort of the diagnosis and the urgency of treatment. She had trusted the doctors, signing forms and agreeing to a minimally invasive procedure without asking too many questions. Now, she pored over the discharge papers, her eyes scanning the clinical language for clues. One document caught her attention, a report detailing the procedure with a brief mention of reproductive tissue manipulation. The phrase was vague, but it sparked a memory of the doctor mentioning advancements in fertility care, words she had dismissed as irrelevant at the time. Her heart sank as she began to piece together a possibility. Could the clinic have mistaken her procedure for something else, inadvertently using one of the frozen embryos? Driven by this new lead, Jada contacted the Columbia Clinic, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. She requested a meeting with the head of the reproductive department, a woman with a reputation for thoroughness. The meeting took place in a sterile office where Jada laid out her questions, presenting the old Charleston records and the recent procedure report. The administrator listened, her face tightening as she reviewed the documents. She promised to investigate, and over the next week, Jada received a series of calls from the clinic, each one more apologetic than the last. The investigation revealed a clerical error, a mix-up in patient records that had occurred during a busy period at the clinic. The frozen embryos, stored in a facility shared by multiple clinics, had been mistakenly accessed during Jada's procedure. The doctor performing the cyst treatment, unaware of the error, had implanted an embryo, believing it to be part of a routine fertility case. The confirmation was both a relief and a new burden. Jada sat in her garden, the familiar scent of her flowers grounding her as she processed the truth. The clinic's mistake had brought her past crashing into her present, reviving a piece of her life she thought was lost forever. She felt a strange mix of anger at the negligence and wonder at the outcome. The child she carried was not a miracle in the supernatural sense, but the result of human error, a chance alignment of forgotten choices and medical oversight. She clutched the Charleston folder, its pages now worn from her repeated handling, and thought of her first husband. The embryo was a piece of him, a fragment of their love preserved through time. Yet the knowledge did little to ease the complexity of her emotions. She was caught between gratitude for this unexpected gift and the weight of a future now forever altered by a past she could not escape. The revelation that Jada's unborn child was a remnant of her life with her first husband reshaped the world around her in Columbia, South Carolina. The truth, uncovered through a tangle of forgotten medical records and clinic errors, lifted the veil of suspicion that had clouded her home, but it introduced a new complexity. Darrell, upon learning the origins of the pregnancy, stood at a crossroads. The man who had spent weeks consumed by doubt now faced the reality of his unfounded accusations. Guilt settled over him, heavy and unyielding, as he recognized the pain he had caused Jada. He sat in their living room, the television off for once, his hands clasped tightly as he wrestled with his emotions. The child was not his, a fact that stirred a quiet ache in his chest, yet he could not ignore the love he still held for Jada. He resolved to bridge the gap he had widened, offering his support with a sincerity that felt both foreign and necessary. He began small acts of amends, preparing her favourite meals, tending to the garden when she was too tired, sitting beside her in silence when words failed him. Jada, meanwhile, navigated her own turbulent emotions. The knowledge that she carried a child tied to her first husband, a man whose memory she had carried through 15 years of quiet mourning, felt like a tether to a life she thought she had left behind. She spent long hours in her garden, the familiar rustle of leaves and scent of blooming marigolds grounding her as she grappled with the surreal reality. In the soft light of dawn, she would sit on her wooden bench, her hands resting on her growing belly, and imagine her first husband's face. She pictured his warm smile, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, and wondered what he would have said about this unexpected gift. The thought brought both comfort and sorrow, a reminder of a love that had shaped her and a loss that had never fully healed. She allowed herself to linger in those memories, letting them wash over her without resistance, as if embracing them might help her make sense of the present. Daryl's family, once distant and judgmental, began to soften. His sister, who had fueled the town's gossip with her sharp tongue, arrived at their home one afternoon with a basket of baby clothes, her expression a mix of apology and tentative warmth. She offered to help prepare the nursery, a gesture that marked a shift in the family's stance. Daryl's parents, though still reserved, called to check on Jada, their voices carrying a cautious acceptance. The community, too, began to rally around her. At the library, where Jada had felt like an outsider under the weight of whispers, her colleagues organised a quiet fundraiser. They collected money for baby supplies, presenting it to her with handwritten notes of encouragement. The gesture, small but heartfelt, eased the isolation that had gripped her for weeks. Jada accepted their support with gratitude, though she still carried the weight of the town's earlier scrutiny, a reminder of how quickly trust could fray. As the weeks passed, Jada found herself settling into a fragile sense of peace. The fear that had once dominated her thoughts, fear of the unknown, of judgment, of the physical toll of pregnancy at her age, began to give way to a quiet acceptance. The child she carried was more than a medical anomaly. It was a bridge to her past, a living connection to the man she had loved so deeply. She spent evenings in the nursery, a small room she and Daryl had begun to prepare, painting the walls a soft yellow and arranging a crib donated by a neighbour. She thought often of names, sifting through memories of conversations with her first husband. If the child was a boy, she decided she would name him after his father, a way to honour the man whose legacy now lived within her. If it was a girl, she would choose a name they had once dreamed of together, a name whispered in late-night talks about a future that never came. The act of preparing for the child became a ritual of reconciliation for Jada. Each fold of a tiny blanket, each book placed on the nursery shelf, was a step toward embracing this unexpected chapter. She found herself revisiting old photographs, pulling them from the attic to place in a small album for the child. The images, her first husband laughing at a picnic, the two of them dancing at a friend's wedding, brought tears but also a strange comfort. She no longer fought the pull of the past, but let it coexist with her present, weaving the two together in her heart. Daryl, too, began to find his place in this new reality. He joined her in the nursery, assembling furniture with a quiet focus, his hands steady despite the complexity of his feelings. He did not speak of his struggles, but his actions, his presence, his care spoke of a commitment to stand by Jada, to build a future that could hold both her past and their shared present. Jada's garden remained her sanctuary, a place where she could process the enormity of what lay ahead. She walked among the roses, their petals soft under her fingertips, and felt a growing sense of purpose. The child was a miracle, not in the supernatural sense, but in the way it had brought her face to face with her history. She no longer questioned why this had happened, but instead focused on what it meant. The pregnancy was a chance to honour a love that had shaped her, to bring a piece of that love into the world. As her belly grew, so did her resolve to face the uncertainties of motherhood with courage. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but in the quiet moments among her flowers, Jada felt a peace she had not known in years, a sense that she was not just carrying a child, but carrying forward a legacy of love that had never truly left her. As spring arrived in Columbia, South Carolina, Jada's life reached a turning point. The air carried the scent of blooming jasmine, and her garden burst with new life, mirroring the transformation within her. After months of uncertainty, fear, and reconciliation, the day of her delivery came. The labor was grueling, a test of her strength at 52, her body pushed to its limits by the demands of childbirth. She lay in the hospital bed, surrounded by the steady beeping of monitors and the calm efficiency of nurses. Darryl remained by her side, his hand occasionally brushing hers, a quiet anchor in the storm of the moment. The doctors, aware of the rarity of her case, monitored her closely, their expertise guiding her through the exhausting hours. When the ordeal ended, Jada held her newborn daughter, a healthy girl whose tiny chest rose and fell with steady breaths. Tears streamed down Jada's face as she gazed at the child, overwhelmed by a surge of love and disbelief. She named the girl Eliza, a name she and her first husband had once chosen in a fleeting moment of dreaming about a family that never came to be. Eliza's features struck Jada immediately. The baby's dark eyes, deep and searching, echoed those of her late father, a man whose memory had lingered in Jada's heart for 15 years. The gentle curve of Eliza's brows, the shape of her tiny nose, carried traces of him, as if time had folded back on itself to bring him into the present. Holding her daughter, Jada felt a profound connection to her past, a bridge to a love she thought had faded into memory. The hospital room, with its sterile walls and soft light, became a sacred space where her grief and joy intertwined. She traced her finger along Eliza's cheek, marveling at the life in her arms, a gift she had never expected to receive. The weight of the past months, the suspicion, the isolation, the search for answers, melted away in that moment, replaced by a quiet certainty that this child was meant to be. Darryl, though initially uncertain about his place in this unconventional family, found himself drawn to Eliza. His doubts, once a barrier between him and Jada, began to dissolve as he watched the tiny girl sleep in her crib. He took on the role of father with a tenderness that surprised even himself. He woke for late-night feedings, cradling Eliza in the dim glow of a lamp, his large hands gentle as he rocked her back to sleep. He pushed her stroller through the neighborhood, nodding to neighbors who now greeted him with smiles instead of whispers. The house, once heavy with tension and mistrust, transformed into a haven of warmth. The sound of Eliza's soft coos filled the rooms, mingling with the laughter that had been absent for so long. Darryl's love for the child grew, not as a replacement for the bond he might have imagined, but as a genuine connection to the life he and Jada were building together. The community of Columbia, once a source of judgment, embraced the new family. Neighbors who had once fueled gossip with their speculation now arrived at Jada's doorstep with gifts, hand-knitted blankets, stuffed animals, and casseroles to ease the early days of parenthood. The library, where Jada had felt like an outcast, became a place of celebration. Her colleagues, who had rallied to support her with their fundraiser, stopped by to meet Eliza, their faces lighting up as they held the baby. The town's rumors faded, replaced by stories of Jada's resilience, her garden now a symbol of renewal rather than a place of retreat. The oak-lined streets of Columbia seemed to soften, their familiarity restored as the community welcomed the child who had, in her own way, brought them together. Jada's garden remained her sanctuary, a place where she could reflect on the journey that had led to this moment. She spent hours there with Eliza, the baby nestled in a carrier against her chest as she tended to her roses and marigolds. The flowers, vibrant under the spring sun, seemed to bloom with new purpose, their colours a backdrop to the stories Jada whispered to her daughter. She spoke of her first husband, weaving tales of his kindness, his laughter, his love for music and late-night walks. Though Eliza would never know him, Jada felt a duty to keep his memory alive, to let her daughter carry a piece of the man who had shaped her mother's heart. The garden, once a refuge from pain, became a place of connection, where Jada could share her past with the child who embodied it. The house, too, became a canvas for this new chapter. Jada and Daryl hung framed photos in the nursery, blending images of their present with snapshots of her past. A picture of Jada's first husband smiling at a long-ago picnic sat beside one of Daryl pushing Eliza's stroller, a quiet acknowledgement of the two men who had shaped her life. Jada moved through her days with a renewed sense of purpose, her love for Eliza anchoring her in the present, while her memories tethered her to the past. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. Motherhood at her age brought challenges, both physical and emotional, but she faced it with a strength she had not known she possessed. Eliza, with her dark eyes and quiet presence, was a gift that transcended time, a living testament to a love that had endured beyond loss. In her daughter, Jada found not just hope, but a profound sense of wholeness, a life that wove together the threads of her past and present into a future she was ready to embrace.